RuneScape is a nearly 23-year-old game, 3 years older than I am. It's undoubtedly one of the most well-known and popular MMOs of all time and still has a massive player base 20 years after its original creation. Not to mention it still receives consistent updates from the development team. It's nearly unheard of for any game's life cycle to last this long and to be this successful throughout it. Even as iconic and well known as RuneScape is, I've never played or honestly even watched much content about it until just a little bit less than a month ago. That is when I started my RuneScape journey, and throughout this video, I'll be talking about my first 30 hours of playing the game. RuneScape has an immediate obstacle that almost no other MMO I've ever played has had. And that obstacle is the fact that it forces new players to choose between two different versions of the game. There is a new school version of RuneScape and an old school version of RuneScape. I will do my best here to describe the differences between these versions and my reasoning for choosing one over the other. The first step I took to try and decide what version of the game to play was by playing through the tutorials for both versions of the game. This honestly did not help at all, because the tutorials are essentially exactly the same, except for a few minor details. After learning that the tutorials clearly weren't going to help me make this decision, I decided to put about 5 hours into both old school and new school to decide which one I ultimately enjoyed more. The differences between old and new school were incredibly apparent as soon as you left the tutorial island. New school teleported you to a version of Lumbridge that was essentially an extension of the tutorial island. Everything you needed was very close by, and this really put me off new school right away. The setup for the city made absolutely no sense, from a city planner angle at least, and was clearly set up just to be a tutorial, even though you just got done with the tutorial. This really killed the world building and immersiveness of the game for me, because nothing made sense where it was placed. The map almost looked cluttered and junky because of how haphazardly things were thrown around. Old school versions of Lumbridge was completely different. Instead of being cluttered with everything you could ever need, it was just a castle with a few buildings and farms around it. The world immediately felt more immersive because of the setup of the area was so much more realistic. Lumbridge in old school didn't just feel like an extension of the tutorial, but instead it felt like the starting point for your epic journey moving forward. Based on my first initial thoughts, you can clearly tell that I enjoyed the setting of old school more, but now I need to get into the details of the differences of combat, XP, quests, and graphics, and some other things that aren't important enough to directly say. There is a significant difference between the combat in new and old school. In new school, a stat called adrenaline becomes extremely important. It dictates what moves and spells that you can use during combat, and you generate it from basic attacks. I honestly never fully understood this mechanic and felt as though it was just an attempt to make the combat system more complex than it needed to be. It would have made a lot more sense just to put cooldown timers on the abilities used, and not base it off both cooldowns and adrenaline. In old school combat, at least at the point I'm currently at, it involves clicking on an enemy and doing nothing else. Sometimes this can get a little bit more complex if you're using a variety of different spells, but for ranged and melee, a click seems to be all I need. My initial thoughts, which have since changed, were that new school's combat system was more complex than it needed to be, and old school's was much too simple. Keep in mind, this is the first 5 hours of both games I've played, so don't give me too much shit in the comments for this opinion here, guys, okay? This is my first 5 hours! The next difference between old school and new that I wanted to talk about is the XP gain. There isn't a ton to talk about here, but I think it's important to point out how much less grindy new school is compared to old school. I feel as though I leveled up twice as fast while playing new school as compared to when I was playing old school. Basically, if you want a less grindy game, new school is for you. But if you like the grindy aspect of most MMOs, old school has exactly what you want. New school RuneScape is possibly one of the most hand-holdy games I've ever played. You would be completely brain dead and easily still complete and figure out almost every single quest and requirement in the game. At least that's my experience that I had in the first 5 hours of play. I don't think there was a single moment that I had to think about anything when playing through new school. Old school is the complete opposite of that. The quest can throw you to the sharks a lot of the time and never ever feel handholdy. Completing even a simple task or quest in old school seems like an achievement because you had to figure it out all on your own. Also, from the quests that I've played of each, New School just seemed to have you do a lot more of things for like shits and giggles and serve as an extended tutorial basically, while Old School had you help the people of the area and learn some basic skills while keeping you immersed in the game. Honestly, throughout my entire time playing New School, there wasn't a single character whose story or quest I cared about. This is an easy point in favor of Old School in my opinion, unlike the other things we've already discussed here, where my opinions on the game are closer. Graphics themselves are something that I don't really want to talk about too much. Everyone is going to have a different, completely valid opinion on what version of the game looks better. I honestly prefer the Old School graphics myself, but this was honestly far from the deciding factor when I was making my final choice. However, the ease of life features that were provided in New School that were absent in Old School were certainly something that made an important difference in my mind. For example, agility in New School doesn't really exist. You can just always run everywhere, which is extremely nice. In Old School, you constantly run out of energy, and it causes you to move from place to place extremely slowly. Movement in Old School RuneScape honestly feels terrible until you take a ton of time to get used to it, especially if you're coming from playing New School first. New School also has features that help you carry items faster that are available to you right away, such as ore boxes and the ability to store both ore and ingots in smithing areas so you don't have to transport them to different areas whenever you want to smith. Honestly, just the ore box, infinite sprint time, and the smithing setup are 3 huge ease of life features that I found right away, while they have been completely absent so far in my time playing Old School RuneScape. And I really want to harp on this, is I imagine there's a lot more ease of life features down the road for New School RuneScape than there is for Old School as well. Everything that I've said so far is what I had to think about before picking which version of RuneScape I should play. I can honestly say that I've never had to play and choose between 2 versions of the same game before, and this choice being forced on you is honestly a pretty big hurdle for a new player to experience. It honestly says a lot about how intriguing and addicting RuneScape is to still manage to grow its player base even with such a big hurdle new players have to go through to enjoy the game. Anyway, I managed to work through this obstacle, and as many of you can probably tell based off of the videos that are on my channel right now, I ended up choosing to take my talents to Old School RuneScape. It was a decision as important as LeBron choosing to leave the Cleveland Cavs and join the Miami Heat. I am a Cleveland Cavs fan, by the way. I didn't like that decision. Anyway, I'll let you know the deciding factors in my decision to play Old School RuneScape. The first and possibly biggest issue that I had with the New School RuneScape is that it felt like the world was just crafted to accomplish tasks in, where things were didn't make much sense, and the quests I was asked to do in those first 5 hours just seemed pointless and lacking in substance. Like I said, for the first 5 hours it felt like an extension of the tutorial island, and that is not a good feeling. The Lumbridge in Old School did a much better job of making the world feel real, and that the things you accomplish actually have some substance. Like helping the chef really made me feel like I was positively affecting the world. Fuck that guy. While in New School, I got told to go kill goblins because it was a part of an extended tutorial pretty much. The second reason I chose Old School is because of how quests were done. I'm not a huge fan of games completely holding your hand and directing you right to the objective without letting you experience things on your own. I understand people with stricter time restraints might prefer questing like that, but I do enjoy feeling like I accomplished something when I go on these quests. Finally, I honestly really enjoy the grind of certain games, and Old School RuneScape was by far more grindy than New School. These are probably the 3 biggest reasons that I chose Old School over New School, but there are a lot of others as well. I don't really get too deep into them though, folks, because this isn't supposed to be a video about what game to choose, but about my experience with RuneScape as a whole.